The levels of anti-Jewish hatred that erupted post-October the 7th surprised global Jewry. I'm delighted to have as my guest now Canaan Lidor, reporter at JNS, Israel and Jewish Diaspora Affairs, to talk about the impact that this war has had on Jews in Europe. Let's get into it. Canaan, what has been your experience of the impact of October the 7th for global Jewry?
It basically brought to the surface things that have been brewing that only the keen-sighted had noticed before and have kind of poured it out in the open. There's open debate now about the future of European Jewry, whereas just 3 years ago, the main topic of discussion among community leaders was better legislation, better enforcement.
In terms of what only a few people saw, I mean, I was quite surprised by the response to October the 7th already on October the 8th, 9th, and 10th, before Israel had even kind of gone in. Here in South Africa, and I think much of Europe, we've seen protests against Israel. Is your sense that people knew that this was going to happen and it was all orchestrated and it was just, or do you think it was spontaneous?
Well, it is certainly in the large cities of Europe, it was spontaneous. I spoke to students in various universities, including Erasmus in Rotterdam, who said that because they live in student dorms, those are usually located in the less affluent parts of the city, and they share the neighborhood with the inner city population, which is heavily Arab and Muslim. And they saw candy being distributed on the street in Erasmus, at the student dorms of Erasmus in Rotterdam, on October 7th, on the day and the day thereafter. So the spontaneity of this sentiment, of this anti-Israel explosion, was spontaneous, at least in the grassroots level.
And in terms of the issues that people are facing regarding the tension in Europe, is there, well, let's rephrase the question, is there tension in Europe between kind of traditional Europeans and immigrants?
There has always been, since the wave of immigration began in the 1970s, there has been tension. But now there is already open hostility. We just saw in Spain an explosion of violence against Muslims. This is also happening in Germany, especially in the East. So again, things are bubbling up to the surface, things that have been dormant for many decades.
How do you see this playing out? I mean, or do you think every country is going to deal with it differently?
Broadly speaking, there have not been any islands. Even the islands haven't been islands. So we're seeing a uniform phenomenon playing out across the continent. And looking back at European history and from the Jewish perspective, I suppose that the Muslim immigration, invasion, however you want to put it, it doesn't have the numbers to really cause a population shift. Yes, they have installed themselves disproportionately in the large cities. So the large cities, which is where tourists and visitors go, they appear to be Muslim and Arab predominantly, heavily, if not predominantly. But when you really look at the numbers, we're talking about 5 to 10% across the continent. And if I were to be so unwise as to make a prediction, I would say that the what we call, or some of us call, the far right in Europe is going to make a resurgence. The AfD, Alternative for Deutschland party in Germany, will reach power. Currently, that's not a problem for Jews because they have pro-Jewish policies. Look at Geert Wilders, the leader of the Netherlands, largest party. This is a philo-Semite, through and through. But from what we know of history and from what we know of the rank and file of those movements, that won't always be the case throughout these movements, and we're probably going to see a reconquista, a reconquest of Europe, just like we saw in the 15th century, and that did not play out well for Jews. And I guess my bottom line is that from Jewish perspective, I'm not so fearful of the Muslims as I am of the pendulum swinging back when European nations wake up and take back their cities.
I mean, it's almost like a hierarchy of who you hate more. Is it anti-Semitism or Islamophobia, or it's just a question of who's next on the hierarchy of hate.
Yes, but the right now the leaders of those that's what's so confusing and so easy to misunderstand. The leaders of those nationalist movements right now are genuinely pro-Israel. It's not that they hate pro-Jewish, pro-Israel. It's not that they hate the Muslims more than they hate the Jews. But when you look at it long term, knowing these populations, knowing how history has played out in Europe, you just can't help but reach the conclusion that underneath the nascent nationalist forces in Europe will change face. It's not that they're hiding their face right now. It's that they'll receive a different dynamic.
Canaan, both of us have lived in Amsterdam, and the images of Jews being beaten up in Amsterdam and forced to show their ID that happened just after a soccer match a little while back. I mean, what is the impact on that on the psyche in Jews in Europe, or at least certainly in the Netherlands?
Now, we've seen a number of these explosions in Amsterdam alone, right? We saw the campus occupations in which people were uh, basically checked for Jewishness. And we saw the November 7, November 8 pogroms in Amsterdam last year because of around the Maccabi games with Ajax. So we saw a number of these cases. Of course, it's an immediate throwback to the Holocaust. This is a deeply traumatized community. You have to remember that in the Netherlands, more than 75% of the Jews were murdered. That's the highest rate in Nazi occupied Western Europe. The community was quite simply decimated. And so this is immediately harking back to those dark days. But I think in the lived experience day to day, it's just a searing sense of humiliation for these
Mm.
people who felt like, yeah, they had their differences, but really they installed themselves in the heart of Dutch society. They had been in the heart of Dutch society for centuries before the Nazi occupation, and now in the 1960s and the 70s, they had finally regained their place, their rightful place, and now comes the bitter, humiliating disillusionment.
Sure. Um, Do you think anti-Semitism is something that European Jews, particularly, are going to have to deal with? It's just part of the territory.
It is, but there are some, uh, I would say, tactics, strategies even, to manage it. In France, we've seen the cantonization of large cities for several decades. So you'll have it's called internal aliyah in Paris. It's when the Jews of the banlieue, the suburbs, and the center move into more secure locations like um, Neuilly-sur-Seine and other eastern neighborhoods where they can live more freely. And at the same time, of course, there's cantonization on the part of the Muslims who are taking over whole neighborhoods, and by the Français de souche, the real Frenchmen, the essential Frenchmen, not the Jews, not the Arabs, the Frenchmen, they just move out of the cities altogether. And it was thought that with this cantonization, life would be more manageable in many of these European countries. And time will tell whether Judaism, in some form, will be able to survive in those places. But at the same time, we're seeing policies that are making life more difficult for European Jews on a national level that you can't escape through internal aliyah. We're seeing bans on Shechita Belgium, the citadel of Haredi Judaism in Europe, is right now investigating all, I think, 8 mohalim in Belgium, and the country already has a ban on shechita. And this is just one of the countries that has bans on shechita. So, and again, this is a response to Muslim immigration, not Jewish presence, a
Yeah.
swinging back of the pendulum that makes life more difficult overall for Jews.
We haven't touched upon Spain yet, and I understand Spain has become extremely hostile. And also, just kind of a follow-up question to that, we're seeing countries recognizing Palestinian state, European countries, Keir Starmer talking about immediate ceasefire for a certain amount of time. What do you make of that?
Well, that's kind of the bait that draws the mainstream Jewish communities into the center of the political debate around Israel. Because what happens is Keir Starmer says we're going to recognize a Palestinian state. The Board of Deputies of British Jews say that's a bad idea. And then they're out in the open getting pummeled by a hostile media. How dare you not acknowledge the suffering in Gaza? So that's kind of the thread that pulls Jewish communities into this debate. They would like nothing more than to avoid it, but these grand political gestures don't leave them any choice because the base of those Jewish communities is, of course, seething and livid over these wrong-headed rewarding of terrorism, and that's what's fueling anti-Semitism. That's what's fueling Jewish artists at music festivals being made to sign declarations that they support a Palestinian state. Those are the actions when Netanyahu or others like Lapid or where Israeli politicians say you are encouraging anti-Semitism. This is what they mean. They draw Jewish communities into the Middle East debate with those status quo altering declarations.
I mean, I know it's something that South African Jews are struggling with as well, is that kind of we're being defined by the people, we're not defining ourselves, and which is not the case. We're being portrayed always in a way of being unsympathetic to the suffering Gaza, which is not true. We've consistently, since October the 7th, acknowledged the terrible suffering in Gaza among innocent civilians. But it's always portrayed somehow in a negative way. But can we go quickly to Spain?
Right, Spain. I was just recently in Spain because just to see on the ground what's happening. I mean, it sounds so bad. You have a prime minister that openly calls Israel the genocidal state. Well, that's nothing new for South African Jews, of course, but in Europe, it's still unusual. You have a large Muslim population, and you have a very strong far left movement agitating these great displays of anti-Israel animosity. We saw that during the Bull Run recently in a city near Valencia. And so uh, on the ground, actually, what I found is a rather flourishing community that has moved through these internal aliyah processes to a northern neighborhood. It has about 7 synagogues fueled by immigration from Argentina. So you have an Orthodox and now also a conservative, because that's the predominant stream in Argentina, synagogues opening up. You have a Jewish school with 400 students that looks like a dream institution, and things are not so bad. So the person I spoke to, Elias Borges of the Enfoque Judío, a Jewish newspaper, he told me you have to separate between the rhetoric of the politicians and the reality on the ground, which is something I hear from South African Jews all the time. So you would really find a lot of commonalities there.
I think probably the community we feel most close to at the moment is probably Spain and Ireland, actually. And we haven't even discussed Ireland yet. But I think, yeah, those are the communities that I think we're experiencing similar. Your feeling, having visited so many of these countries, do you find, like in Spain, like in South Africa, that it's the leadership that is leading it and possibly hostile media, in your words? and that the ordinary citizens are not actually as hostile as we are made to believe.
The ordinary citizens are disinterested in the issue generally, uh, not anything beyond the superficial level. But I think what makes the difference in terms of the lived experience of anti-Semitism, it's something that I've realized through the Irish example, actually, quite recently, is accountability. So you have countries like France or Germany and the UK. We thousands of incidents happen annually, but offenders are prosecuted, the communities are protected, there's accountability. And on the other hand, you have communities like Ireland where very few cases happen annually, but perpetrators are just given a free pass. We saw this recently in the University of Limerick, where a senior lecturer assaulted a student for showing an Israeli flag at an off-campus event. And we broke the story at JNS, the Jewish News Syndicate. And there was just complete silence about it from the university, from the Ministry of Education, from the Council of Higher Education. It was just, it's like it didn't happen. And that's something that's unimaginable. Even in Germany and France, and that dominate the headlines of anti-Semitic attacks, there would still be some accountability for this thug. And there isn't in Ireland, and that means that the lived experience of anti-Semitism in
Mm-hmm.
those countries where there are no consequences for anti-Jewish hatred and violence is much greater than in the other ones.
Sure. We're going to leave it there, but I hope to have you more regularly as my guest.
Thank you. I'd love that.
Thank you so much for your insight.